My name is Stan Voelkel with Voelkel Commercial Advisors. And what I wanted to do is have a short video and talk to a legal expert with regard to some of the things that are going on right now. Right now, we're in the middle of COVID virus, and a lot of tenants are really have a lot of tough choices to make with regard to how they spend their money at this point. I had clients that have decided to not pay any rent or pay partial rent. They're laying off staff. They've got a lot of things going on. And so I thought it'd be a good idea to bring in a legal expert to help us kind of just talk about a few of these things. So who I have here today is a friend of mine and who's a real estate attorney that I've done work with in the past. His name is Tri Nguyen. So Tri, if you just take a minute or so and tell us about what you do. And then after that, we'll jump in and talk about, kind of the current situation of what tenants are seeing, what they're doing, and how you are advising some of your clients in these tough times. So with that, if you just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Thank you, Stan. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you and to talk to some of your viewers. My name is Tri Nguyen. I'm a corporate business and commercial real estate attorney. I've been doing this for about 18 or 19 years now. Generally, I'm a deal guy. And on the leasing side, I represent both the tenant and the landlord in lease negotiations, commercial development, and so on. So this is an extremely timely subject, and be happy to contribute to the conversation.
Well, thanks. So first of all, once again, what are you seeing from just out there in the marketplace? What are you hearing from? And it's not just me; it's just from other brokers as well. What are you hearing that people are experiencing? Tenants are experiencing. What brokers are seeing? What landlords are seeing?
Yeah. So I mean, I think the immediate thing on everybody's minds is tomorrow's April 1st, so rent is due, and mortgage payments are probably due not too shortly after that. So the tenant side, a lot of people are concerned because they don't have the cash flow to pay rent, and they're worried about what's going to happen. Now, remember though that the lease agreement it's an agreement, it's a binding document, and electing not to pay rent, for example, or having the ability not to pay rent is governed by the agreement. And so what I would encourage people to do, if they're not able to, is to review their lease agreement to see what provisions might apply. And, this could be a force majeure provision that says, that may cover this situation. But also remember that landlords tend to be pretty understanding because they're in the sort of the same position to their lenders. And so from the landlord's perspective, they too may want to take a look at the lease agreements because there may be obligations in those leases that they continue keeping the building open for business. For example, like, if you have an office building and the landlord has elected to close the building because of fear of the spread of COVID-19, provisions in the lease may indicate that is a default by the landlord. So the lease agreement is going to really drive the situation. And my sense of it is that landlords are going to be willing to work with tenants. And so the key here is not to just, unilaterally breach the contract, but to have an open communication system between the landlord and the tenant to try to work things out, to come up with an amicable sort of solution.
And I think that's a great point, Ryan. And that's one thing that I've advised my clients. Actually, two of them is, look, I understand you not paying rent or paying partial rent. That if I was in your position, I'd certainly do the same thing. But I think it goes a long ways to have a conversation. First of all, the landlord, no, you're not the only one calling and saying or saying, hey, you're getting a little bit less than what you normally get. But I think it goes a long ways if you can have a conversation with the landlord, just a friendly call, tell them what's going on. They know what's going on, but you calling as opposed to you just not sending in a check or sending a partial check and then hiding from them.
Right.
Hiding from them is going to make things much worse. And I think, like you say, if you have that dialogue with them, I think it's going to go a long ways to help them just to get to the point where they're going to be willing to work with you. And I think that, once again, I think that goes a long ways. And I think that's a great point. One of the things that a lot of tenants may not realize is that even though I'm a tenant rep, I certainly understand, look, landlords have their obligations as well. And there are things that, they've got payments due and expenses as well. So I certainly understand their position. There is
Mm.
something that came out the other day that the Cheesecake Factory, which is a restaurant chain, had said they're going to just stop paying rent on all their locations, which, that's going to cause a lot of heartache for the landlords. But certainly I understand with, Cheesecake Factory's
Yeah,
situation, what they're dealing with.
right.
But you had mentioned earlier about the some of the provisions in the lease, and prior to 9/11, the clause of force majeure with regard to terrorism really wasn't something that was in the leases, and then it
Right,
got into every lease. So I
right.
I don't know that pandemics are specific language that you see, but I feel
Yeah.
like moving forward, it's going to be something that's going to be in future leases, and it's
Oh,
going to be
yeah,
something that we're
totally.
going to have to talk about. So we talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, totally. I think that's right. I've only seen a few leases with pandemic or sort of national health crisis as part of the force majeure. And so I expect that that concept will start making its way into future leases. But depending on sort of currently what the leases that are out there now, the force majeure provision typically will exclude rental payments or payment obligation from the force majeure sort of clause, would impact a bunch of tenants that are out there. I mean, many, unless you're a cheesecake factory who that has, maybe good corporate guarantees, or maybe they're so credit worthy they don't need any corporate guarantees, they can default and be okay. But a lot of the tenants that are out there have personal guarantees, and they
Right.
haven't really had a really strong lease negotiated in their favor. And so, many times there is a force majeure provision, but it's more related to performance under the lease, not necessarily payments. So that's something that tenants may want to check, because it may say that except for the payments under this lease, if there's a force majeure event, the parties are excused for a certain period of time.
Yeah.
And that may be helpful to the landlord, because the landlord can say, well, I can't open the building or continue providing janitorial services or providing security because there's a pandemic or some kind of national order, or local governmental order to stay shut.
Right.
And they can try to point to that and not be default under the lease. But unfortunately for many tenants, the payment obligations are not excused. But again, tenants need to review their lease agreements, same as.
I'm not a real estate attorney. I'm not an attorney at all. So I mean, I know the lease document, but I always recommend my clients that they hire a competent real estate attorney when they get into a real estate transaction, because the devil is always in the details. And one thing I've always said is that a lease document is something it's signed, but it really isn't brought out until there's a problem.
That's right. Yeah.
If you could kind of speak to some of the nuances of leases, and why it's important to have a professional review a lease document. Maybe now's the time for them to, I'm sure some people are pulling out their lease document and saying, first of all, they're 30 to 40 pages, and they're probably saying, where do I start? Right.
Yeah.
Are you having some of your clients come to you and say, hey, look, this is a situation, will you take a look at our lease? Is that something that's going on right now?
It is. Yep. And a lot of people are doing it themselves. A lot of people are contacting, attorneys like me to help them work through what their obligations might be. But, just before I jump into that, something occurred to me that when you were saying earlier, is that now may not be a bad time to actually see if you can renegotiate the lease.
Yep.
Especially if you're credit worthy and you have a strong business. The situation is not because your business is not great. It's just, the entire world is shut down.
Right.
The typical provisions, I think, off the top of my head, if you're a retail tenant, usually there is a provision that requires you to stay open for a certain period of time.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And obviously you can't do that. Being able to stay open could be excused under force majeure, but then you've got to look at the force majeure provision to see if pandemic or governmental orders is something that's covered by it. Contract interpretations in this period of time, as a tenant, you can put a stake in the ground and say, this is a force majeure, so I'm not going to open, I'm not excused from the lease. But looking 2, 3, 4 months down the line, if you don't have a good line of communication with the landlord to discuss sort of scenarios and try to work out a solution, I think that it will come back to bite you.
Yeah.
And so we're going back, basically going back to get some good help and start the line of communication with the landlord. That's one provision that would be applicable to retail tenants. And from an office perspective, certainly there's less of an obligation to stay open, able to access the building because it's been locked down. Then that is something that tenants can use as an excuse not to pay rent. But again, it could come back and bite you in the long run because landlords have a different position, and it's
Right.
better to be upfront about it and address it. And landlords have, on the other side, they have mortgage payments that they have to do. Sometimes those mortgage documents have covenants that say you've got to have a certain level of occupancy, right?
Right.
And so it may be better for the landlords to have tenants in their space, even if it's a reduced rental payment, than not having any tenants in their space at all, and
Yeah.
then try to go through the process of evictions and so on. And bankers understand this situation, and so they may be able to work with the landlords, who then can work with the tenants.
Yeah. So let me ask you a question with regard to that. So a lease document, is it likely that a landlord could say, hey, look, I'm only going to enforce certain provisions of the lease. I'm not going to enforce the you've got to be open
Sure.
8 to 5 for certain. Can they just choose not to enforce that part? Like,
Yeah.
it's not like there's another entity out there, like a legal entity, like the government saying, well, yeah, you've got to be open. It's just an agreement between you and the landlord, which says, hey, I'm going to be open, but the landlord can say, look, I really don't,
Yeah.
I'm not going to enforce that provision.
Right. Yeah. The landlord can pick and choose. Typically, there's a waiver provision or no waiver provision in the lease that says the landlord can waive certain provisions and not others. And sometimes, they can choose to enforce some provisions and not others. And so that's typically not an issue. So the thing about, these lease agreements is that, as you say, they're between two private parties, unless the government or some government institution comes in and says, time of crisis, parties, you don't have to abide by X, Y, and Z provision
Right.
or something like that. For
Yeah.
instance,
And you're hearing that in some cities as well, like Seattle
right.
is having a no eviction during a certain
Right.
period
Yeah.
of time.
And those, yeah, and those, those fall usually in the residential
Right.
real estate realm, but that's an example. You've got a contract between a residential landlord and a residential tenant. The government has issued an order saying you got to stop foreclosures, you got to stop evictions, you are not allowed to report to the credit agencies if they've missed rental payments and so on. So unfortunately at this point we haven't seen anything like that in the commercial real estate realm.
Yeah.
And I think there are other sort of resources that landlords and tenants can go to, particularly the new stimulus package, to try to help alleviate some of the pain. But
Right.
it takes time. The paycheck protection program probably won't people won't start seeing money until maybe 3-4 weeks down the line. That's
Yeah.
another that's
There's a bit
another
of,
rental term,
yeah,
payment
so
term. Yeah.
that's a good point. So you have April 1st rent due, let's say for most, they're about that time.
Yeah.
And then, if you're talking about 3 or 4 weeks, you're talking about
Yeah.
May 1st, another
Right.
period in which rent's due, and tenants are going to
Yeah.
have to make another decision as to whether they do anything about it or not.
Well, so the other thing to keep in mind is that landlords just can't, even on the commercial side, landlords can't just kick tenants out. And
Yeah.
so if there is a situation where a tenant can't make payments, there's a process that the landlord still has to go through to give notice, and then certified mail and all that stuff before they can actually lock someone out, or take action against, sort of true legal action against the
Right.
tenant. So there is some time you miss one payment, then remember there's the security deposit that can come in that the landlord can rely on. During that period of time, you can work out a solution. Even on the landlord side, just taking some sort of legal action against the tenant takes time as well. And time is probably the most crucial thing right now, because things are moving so quickly that but maybe by the end of April, these programs are in place. Yeah, the banks are more flexible on their covenants and
Yep.
payments, and then it sort of flows down to the tenants.
More cash in the market.
Right,
Definitely
right.
to be sure about that.
So yeah, so I think that at the end of it, what I would discourage tenants to do is just walk the lease. I know that a lot of tenants are considering letting their workforce go, cutting down on kind of expense that they can. But take the view of it this as being temporary, and temporary here may be 6 months,
Right.
but then look to these other resources and really take the steps to apply for the payroll protection program or the new SBA loan program that
Hmm.
allows for sort of these quicker loans to be applied for and issued.
Right. Well, there's definitely a lot of things going on right now, and it's going to. I'm really curious to see just how things play out. Obviously, we're all hoping to get back to work sooner rather than later. We're all seeing from home, but yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on, and we get through kind of the first couple of weeks of what tenants are hearing back from the landlords, from them either not paying rent or not paying
Yeah,
full rent.
right.
I'm in contact with my
I
clients,
mean,
so I do
yeah,
want to know from them, what are they hearing, and obviously I'm in contact with the brokers that represent the landlords and what they're
sure.
hearing as
Right.
well. And so it just as a way to advise your clients on
Yeah.
what to do.
Yeah, totally. And so some of the things that a tenant can ask for from a landlord is, sort of, can we do some rent abatements? Can we extend the term of the lease
Yeah,
so that there's a period of non-rental payments, or maybe just pay the additional rent but not the base rent during
right.
a certain period of time, and then make it up at the back end, or spread those payments out over
Period.
a
Yeah,
longer period, sort of just roll it into, an increased monthly payment starting 6 months down the line,
yeah,
or a year down the line.
right.
So there are different ways to sort of structure it. I think that really some of it is going to be driven by what the landlord's debt covenants allow,
Yeah,
and what else they have, going on for the property. Like if the landlord is expecting to, let's say, demolish the property and rebuild it, then they're expecting tenants to be out of the building by a certain period of time. And so they won't be able to extend the lease term. That means you can't really tack on the payments in the back end. You've just got to spread it out over the remainder of the lease. If a tenant's got maybe 6 months left on the lease, then that's an easier situation to just both sides agree, okay, we're just going to terminate it and let the tenant out early. So every situation is different for both the tenant and the landlord. And again, it's just open communication.
right.
Get someone to help you, if help do the negotiations, and you're going to be super busy in the next few weeks, Stan.
Yeah.
I think just trying to help tenants do these renegotiate.
No, that's a great point. There's going to be a lot of renegotiated leases, obviously, as a way of kind of smoothing out the non-payment or partial payment at
Yeah,
this time. With that being said, Tri, thanks for your time.
yeah, sure,
Tell us again, real quickly, how to contact you. I'm going to put it in
sure.
the notes below,
Okay,
but
yeah. Actually, I've actually started a program of doing, sort of, initial consultations at no cost,
okay,
and if people want to sign up for a 15-minute conversation, they can go to my website. It's worldwideweb.trilawoffice.com. So worldwideweb.trilawoffice.com.
perfect,
Thanks so
perfect,
much.
great. First of all, thanks for everyone for watching this. If you have any comments, please leave them below. But if you like what you see, please like below. If you have any comments, make comments. And if someone may get some benefit out of this, please share it. And Tribe, once again, thanks for your time. Really appreciate it.
Yep, appreciate it. Enjoyed it, Stan.
All right, take care. We'll
Take
talk
care.
soon. I know we
Stay
will.
safe.